Hey guys, it is I, the Comics Kid 2099, and it is time for another rant, don't you think? Today, I want to rant about Alan Moore and his semi-ongoing comic book series, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. For those of you who are only familiar with the 2003 movie starring Sean Connery, or you're not familiar with this property at all, I am going to be talking about the comic book that inspired that movie. But for the purposes of this video, the premise of one is fairly similar to the premise of the other. I first came into contact with this franchise through the movie. When I first saw it, I liked it quite a bit. It was like a superhero movie with adventure heroes from the 1800s. What's not to like? And then later I found out that there were comic books, and I read them, and pretty much ever since then I've hated the movie because I realized how much better the comics were. So anyway, when I discovered the comics, there were two complete stories collected in two trade paperbacks. Both of these stories are simply outstanding. The idea that all of British literature, cinema, and entertainment overall exists in one shared universe in a similar manner to the Marvel Universe or the DC Universe, that is a really cool idea. And it's one that can provide a near infinite amount of stories in case you are running out of ideas. You've got a team of misfit heroes and outcasts working for the British government, fighting bad guys and monsters and stuff. If you get bored using the characters you are using, you can just replace them and get some new characters who are around from that same time period. It doesn't matter if those characters originally died in the books they were in, because most of the characters in this version of the League were technically dead as per the original works by the creators of those characters. It's easy enough for Alan Moore to say, well, they faked their deaths. There is really no shortage of stories you can tell, and no shortage of characters you can use using this premise. This is great when you are a writer, because sometimes a series you are working on might be very hard to write for, so anything that makes coming up with ideas easier is always welcome. And Moore wasn't only working with Victorian fiction, although that's predominantly what he was working with in the first two volumes of this series. There was one issue in Volume 2 where Captain Nemo saves a boy named Jimmy Gray. When saying their farewells to each other, Jimmy tells Nemo that one day he will build his very own giant fish as an homage to Nemo's Nautilus. We're left to assume that this boy is one Professor Gray from the 1940s Iron Fish comic strip from the British comic book Beano. Hey, if Moore is referencing fictional characters from a 1940s comic strip, what's to stop him from using characters from film and comic books and even music in later stories set in this world? I'll get to this very shortly. But first, you may be wondering, Comics Kid, you seem to have a lot of nice things to say about this series, but this is a rant video, right? Where's the ranting? Alright, here comes the beginning of the rant. If you haven't yet read Volume 2 of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen series, I urge you to read it, because I'm about to spoil the ending of that book. So Volume 2 of this series features the characters of this team fighting the Martians from H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. And by the end of the story, Mr. Hyde has brutally killed the Invisible Man for betraying the group to the alien invaders. Then Mr. Hyde dies fighting off the invaders, while British intelligence prepares their ultimate weapon against the aliens. This ultimate weapon is a hybrid of anthrax and the common cold, which destroys the Martians as well as any remaining humans who were in the area where the Martians were grouped together. If you will recall, in Wells' War of the Worlds novel, the aliens eventually all died because of the common cold. So Moore is postulating that this was actually a calculated attack from humanity, which, Anyway, after killing off two of the 5 characters of this book, Moore then has Nemo leave the team. Nemo is furious that he has been working with people who are so morally evil that they have no problem killing innocent humans in order to eliminate the bad guys. Now, let me just say that, as a story, this is just fine. It works well on its own, and it is a great way to end this story. But the problem is twofold. One, this isn't the end of the story. 4 years after the conclusion of the Martian invasion storyline, we got The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Black Dossier, which was a standalone graphic novel that acted as sort of an interlude in between Volume 2 and what would eventually be Volume 3. This took 2 of the remaining characters from the end of Volume 2, Alan and Mina, who had in between these 2 stories found immortality, and this story put them in the 1950s. Now, this was actually something that sounded really interesting to me. Like I said earlier, the very premise of this series is nearly unlimited in what it can do. If Moore did some good stories in the 1890s and we liked them, then what would it be like if Moore did some stories in the 1950s or the 60s or the present day, using characters from fiction from each of these different eras of time? The problems all come back to the end of the League Volume 2, in my humble. When Moore killed or removed 3/5 of the League team, he basically demonstrated that every character is disposable, and that none of them are really safe or even matter in the grand scheme of things, because he can just replace them and bring in new characters in the story. Now, this was something of a pro when I was talking about this earlier. It is good to have the option of getting rid of a character when they are boring and having the option of bringing in new characters when you need to. But after only 12 issues, Moore killed 2 characters who, if you ask me, still had stories in them to tell. And he gets rid of the other character in a more or less permanent fashion. And this basically is the pattern that Moore followed for the remaining League stories that I followed. Characters would stick around just long enough for you to remember their name, and then they'd get killed, or Moore would jump forward 3 decades, and there'd be very little chance that you'd ever see that character again. The whole idea that characters are disposable wouldn't be so bad if Moore had just stuck with the concept that the first 2 books were about. Misfits, monsters, and other M-words working for the government in different time periods. If he gets rid of Captain Nemo, Mr. Hyde, and the Invisible Man, then in theory, he can just do some stories with a new league, with Orlando, or Carnacki the Ghost Finder, or A.J. Raffles, Gentleman Thief, or whatever. But that wasn't what Alan Moore wanted to do. As I said, The Black Dossier was the next story after Volume 2. It was set in the 1950s, and according to the World of the League, the events of 1984, the novel by George Orwell, were actually events in the World of the League, and they took place in 1948. So I guess 1984 was an actual book in this world, and the author just inverted the numbers of the year to make it air quotes fictional. We are told in this story that at some point in the previous decade, Alan and Mina, who had both become immortal, as I said earlier, unbeknownst to their superiors, had gone AWOL, and the government just assumed that they were dead, or assumed that they had never existed in the first place. And so then the story was about Alan and Mina trying to get all of the secret information the government had on them, and the government trying to chase them down and get the titular Black Dossier back. At this point, I think this is where Alan Moore really just kind of lost what made the series interesting and fun. For one thing, he abandoned the concept. This series is no longer about a team of characters from all different walks of fiction teaming up and fighting a threat together. Now it's about Alan Moore whining like a baby that James Bond is terrible and that why can't things be good like they used to be back in the day. Now this is just baffling to me. You have characters like the Invisible Man or Mr. Hyde. Very clearly not good people at all. Mr. Hyde threatened to rape and murder people who would just look at him the wrong way. Heck, he did rape and murder in the course of Volume 2, and somehow Alan Moore thinks that this character is noble and virtuous and that he should have a statue built to commemorate his nobility or some bullcrap like that. But Alan Moore seems to think that James Bond, a hero who has risked his life for Queen and country on multiple occasions, is pond scum and that he is a liar and a coward. The Black Dossier isn't even really a story. It's just Alan Moore's dissertation that fiction has gone down the toilet and that everything sucks now and why can't it be like it used to be. Now, admittedly, everyone is like that. You will not find a single person who will ever say that the entertainment they consume now is better than what they consumed when they were children. This nostalgic attitude is why authors in the field of comics will try to make things the way they were when they were kids. Grant Morrison, Jeff Johns, and even Roy Thomas from back in the day. So this attitude is certainly not limited to Alan Moore. But let's be realistic here. Alan Moore is taking some very questionable characters and saying that they are somehow virtuous, for no other reason than they came from an earlier period of time. And he is saying that everything that is younger than, let's say 75 years is awful and should be ignored at all costs. He doesn't just do this with James Bond. He does it with Jack Carter. He does it with Harry Potter. And because I like for my videos to be more or less family friendly, I won't even talk about what Alan Moore did with Harry Potter, except to say that what Alan Moore did with this character is in no way something that resembled the character that J.K. Rowling used in her Harry Potter books. If you're interested to see what Moore did with Harry, Google it around, but I will not tell you here just because I can tell you that it is not pleasant. In fact, that's a good segue into another complaint I have about this series. Remember when I said that I was excited to see Alan Moore take this series further into the 20th century? Granted, that was under the idea that he would continue the concept that he had in the first 2 volumes. Maybe just do a brand new version of the League with brand new characters from the 1950s and repeat the same formula that he had in the first 2 volumes. But a problem quickly arises from this series when you read the Black Dossier and basically any other story set later in time. When you read the Black Dossier, it's very clear that the villain of this piece is meant to be James Bond, but you never actually hear his last name uttered in the Black Dossier. Admittedly, Mina does mention his grandfather, and in the previous 2 volumes, the League did work for one Campion Bond, but in this story, you never hear the name Bond. People just call him Jimmy. The same with Harry Potter, Jack Carter, and every other character set in the story set after the Black Dossier. It becomes pretty apparent why Moore chose to set the first stories in the 1890s. Characters like Captain Nemo and Alan Quatermain are in the public domain. Anyone can tell stories about these characters without having to pay royalties or having to pay a fine for defamation of the character. But public domain more or less works in a way where, after 75 years, the character is free to be used by any other author. I'm not exactly sure how it works in Great Britain. I do know that public domain laws are a little different over there than they are in America, but for the purposes of this video, it is what it is. If you do want to use, say, Harry Potter or James Bond, then you can't use their real name. And in the case of Alan Moore, you have to make the character so unrecognizable that it is basically not even the same character in the first place. What was so great about the first 2 volumes is that even if you have never read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, you don't have to because, well, you know who this guy is. And if you don't, if you've never heard of Captain Nemo, this story still tells you his name and a little bit about him. If you've never heard of Jack Carter, the movie or the character, then sorry, but you're out of luck. You just have to figure it out as you go. This is something that didn't really occur to me when I first heard that a League book would be set in the 1950s. I just liked the idea of furthering the world of the League. And despite everything that I hate about the League now, the cynical and jaded attitude of Alan Moore using these comics as his own personal soapbox, or how it becomes increasingly harder to understand or even read these books because of how insular the whole thing has become, I still enjoyed seeing characters and references that I recognized without having to go to a series of lengthy annotations just to understand what this one character in the background is doing in this early volume, if it's not a main character anyway. So yeah, that's really all I had to say. This all basically got started when I saw that a new League book called Nemo: Heart of Ice was out. This book is set in the 1920s, and actually stars Captain Nemo's daughter, who is sort of an invention of Alan Moore and never existed in the original Jules Verne novels. I thought it looked interesting, even though I had actually dropped this series completely after the Century 1910 segment, for more or less the same reasons that I've given here. But my interest was piqued. I went and ordered the other 2 chapters of the Century storyline that I was missing, and I read all of the League stuff in order of how it was published. And all of this that I've laid out in video form for you now, it all just came rushing back to me. I remembered why I had dropped the series in the first place, and in fact, reading it all back to back like I did, it felt even worse than it did the first time around, when I was waiting for installments of this series to come out. So you may be asking, if you dropped this series once and you deliberately went back to it, why were you such a stupid idiot head? There's a very good reason why I was a stupid idiot head, and the reason is one of the first things I praised about this series at the beginning of this video. The premise is what I loved when I first got into this series, and it's what I still love, even with all of the nasty, awful stuff that I hate about this series. And you know what? This premise is not unique to the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. This video, it's just as much for me as it is for you. 2 years from now, when there's going to be another League of Extraordinary Gentlemen book, I want to have this video for myself to look back to. When I get to feeling nostalgic for the premise that is presented here, I can look to other sources where this idea is used. Kim Newman's Anno Dracula series, Philip Jose Farmer's Walt Newton stuff, John Lescroart's Son of Holmes books. These all experiment with the idea of fictional characters from multiple different media and stories all coexisting in one single shared universe. So when I want to read a story about some characters from multiple authors all meeting each other, I need to just go back and listen to my own words and go and dip my mind into one of these other series. Heck, the Walt Newton stuff is even huger online than it ever was in print form, and it's free to go and waste hours of your life looking at that website. It'd be cheaper than paying $15 for a 55-page graphic novel with the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen title on it anyway. So, I hope this video was as useful for you as it will hopefully be for me. After reading the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen nonsense, it's been a good catharsis for me. And it will hopefully be a good way to keep me from returning to this abusive spouse that is this series. And if this video was something that you liked, then I hope you will share it, like it, subscribe, and comment, and do all of these things that you love doing on YouTube videos. In the meantime, I will be back tomorrow with some other kind of video. I'll see you then.